It's no surprise that with any video game, not everything that is planned ends up in the final version of the game. Most of the time, this can be a good thing. Whether it be due to time constraints, technical difficulties, or just a case of the developers deciding to scrap an idea because they thought it sucked. Many plans and assets often get left out of a game. Today we're going to look at a few of these instances in Final Fantasy IX. It might go without saying, but there will be spoilers here. Final Fantasy IX was something of a return to the series' roots, as many know. It was set in a more medieval, steampunkish world, a drastic change from the previous two games in the series, 7 and 8, both of which have a more modern setting. The game actually began development before Final Fantasy VIII was even finished, as well as being developed alongside Final Fantasies X and 11, which are all drastically different from both a setting and gameplay perspective. Being that these games were developed somewhat simultaneously, you gotta wonder which ideas that wound up in one game were possibly intended for another. Kind of like the song Eyes on Me in Final Fantasy VIII, which was actually intended to be in Final Fantasy VII. With that said, let's take a look at what could have been in Final Fantasy IX. JRPGs are usually planned with tons of ideas in mind that are often changed throughout development. Final Fantasy VII and 8 are a good example, as there is a lot of data left in the game that went unused. However, there isn't as much in the way of unused content for Final Fantasy IX as one might think, but that doesn't mean I wasn't able to find anything. In fact, most of the stuff that I did find is rather interesting in my opinion. As mentioned before, it's also possible that ideas for this game could have been repurposed for another title, but we'll never really know that for sure. The lack of significant unused content left within the game's files could also suggest that Square was more diligent about removing excess data from the final product. And with all that out of the way, let's get into the unused content of Final Fantasy IX. The first thing I want to look at is a piece of concept art that pertains to potentially unused ideas. And I know what you're thinking, concept art isn't unused content, but don't worry, we will go over actual content that was omitted from the game, but these works do provide a lot of information about ideas that were left out of the game. The job system has become a staple of the franchise, appearing most prominently in the third and fifth game. Being that this game draws a lot of inspiration from previous games in the series, it seems a job system was planned for Final Fantasy IX, as shown in this concept art here. It looks like a number of job classes were once intended to be a part of the game. Here we see the Dragoon, Viking, Elemental User, Light Magician, Dark Knight, Scholar, Archer, and Bard. Except for things like the Dragoon, these mostly went unutilized, as we did get more classic jobs within the final game. It's fun to look at these and see how different the game could have been. These could have been a template for choosing which jobs should be assigned to which characters. That, or these could have just been NPCs that we see around the world, which is more likely the case, seeing as how we do see nameless NPCs that are simply called female and male red mages throughout the game. While we did end up with characters who had preset roles, it's still fun to look at these images and see what elements were taken and implemented into the game that we know today. There are also a few scenes that have been removed or slightly altered. One such scene is when Zidane is in the crashed Prima Vista in the Evil Forest, contemplating whether or not to go search for Garnet. It's pretty creepy actually. We can see Garnet running all over the blank screen, kinda symbolizing her wandering, lost through Zidane's mind. This scene seemed to have been scrapped halfway before completion though, as you can also see some assets left on the screen, such as Vivi's hat and gloves. It's just creepy and I love it. At one point in the game, Lindblom Castle is attacked and occupied by Alexandria. Having guards all over the castle makes it difficult to get in to see Regent Cid to figure out what happened. In order to get into the castle, we have to talk to this guy who will help us sneak in. In the final game, all we have to really do is talk to him and then we're in. However, in this removed scene, it shows a segment where Zidane has to sneak past the Alexandrian guards without being detected. As I mentioned, there are a few other removed and altered scenes, but they're really not as interesting as the ones I'm showing here, as they're mostly just minor script changes. I found these scenes posted by another user on YouTube who has a compilation of these removed scenes, if you're interested in seeing the rest of them. As credit for the clips goes directly to them, I'll also put a link to their channel in my description. There is another scene that I'll show a little later on, which isn't exactly a cutscene, but it is probably the most interesting, at least from a gameplay perspective. Again, while there isn't a huge amount of unused content for Final Fantasy IX, at least that we know of, there are a lot of ideas that have gone unutilized, such as this menu we see when talking to the Moogle Kupo in Alexandria. We see the Mog Shop and Switch Party Members options here, which do get used later on in the game, but perhaps these could have been default options for every Moogle. The one that's glaringly obvious is the debug menu. This was clearly just in place during development and serves no purpose in the final game, as if you were to access this option through hacking, it doesn't do anything. Another very interesting cut from the game is this character portrait and victory animation for Cinna. The other main members of Tantalus, Blank and Marcus, do join the party as guest characters and have menu portraits and victory animations in battle. It seems Cinna was also meant to have the same honor, but this was scrapped for whatever reason. It's possible that when Marcus joins Dagger and Steiner while crossing South Gate, that Cinna may have been intended to join them, as there would have been room for another party member, and this is where we would have probably seen this portrait in animation. Though it's minor, there's also the staircase in Lindblom Castle that seems to have been an escalator at one point in development, which explains the gears that are underneath the staircase. When you enter Fossil Rue, you immediately have to run from this big-ass mechanical thing known as Armadulahan. It'll chase you along a bridge while you're dodging these conveniently placed axes swinging from the ceiling. The axes don't really do anything besides slow you down, which is honestly scarier than what a swinging axe might realistically do to you when you consider the context here. Once far enough, you'll cross a gap where the bridge is broken and where the Armadulahan will fall through. Though this gap is just there in the final game, based on this image, it looks as if you were meant to use this TNT plunger to blast the bridge apart to stop the Armadulahan yourself. If this was in the final game, I don't really know what would have happened if you failed to do this in time. Maybe you would have had to fight the thing for real? If this was the case, the developers may have thought this would have been too difficult, as immediately after you escape it you have to fight Lanny, and there are no Moogles to save in between the Armadulahan and her. Because Lanny is a considerably challenging boss, this makes a lot of sense. Another small piece of weird content that's hidden in the Katoblipas model isn't exactly unused, but you don't get to see it for obvious reasons. There's a small pixely deer hidden in a few places within the model. There seems to be a history of the developers putting these small images within other models. For example, in Final Fantasy VIII, there's a smaller cactuar hidden within the cactuar model. This screenshot shows that Alexandria Dungeon originally had an area title, brilliantly called Alexandria Dungeon. It could have been that there may have been more to this area than what made it into the final game. At the point where the party is captured by Zorn and Thorn here, maybe you would have had to somehow escape instead of having Blank and Marcus immediately rescue you. Based on the fact that it's labeled as Alexandria Dungeon, it does seem odd that there would have been a title to this area for just one screen, though it could be argued that everything beneath the castle could be considered the dungeon. Before I get to the final and arguably most interesting clip, I do want to go through a little bit more concept art. Even though concept art doesn't necessarily constitute unused content, it does give us insight to ideas that may have been intended for use within the game, which I know is another discussion completely, but the few pieces that I wanted to show here are rather interesting. This art of Queen Braun has a few neat details to it, from the frog-leg table to what seems like little fairies tied to these burning incense sticks. But the elephant in the room, and I don't mean Queen Braun, is the giant cat that she's sitting on. While we never see this cat anywhere in game, it is worth noting that in this portrait we see of Braun, she is holding an animal that resembles the Gimme Cat enemy that you can find near Daguerreo. Even though we never see Braun with a cat of any kind, there are these Bandersnatch enemies that she sends after the party in Alexandria, which are seemingly out of nowhere. Though Bandersnatches are more canine than feline, it's possible that the artwork for the giant cat inspired this design of these nightmares. This unused concept for a small farm-looking town was quite clearly the inspiration for what became Dali in the final game. Other than it just being a peaceful-looking town, there isn't really much to speak of here. Hey, not all the unused content is going to be that interesting. I personally love this one. Everything about it is just aesthetically pleasing to me. And though you never see this waterfall anywhere in the final game, I did notice that it looks similar to the shot from when you're escaping Evil Forest. There is also this waterfall sort of hidden in the forest as well, so it seems that these two spots could have taken influence from this unfortunately discarded waterfall. I'm putting these next two together because they're both tree-based areas, the first showing what looks like small huts on the tree canopies of a place seemingly known as Ape Town, where you can see some person walking down a path towards some structure, and next to them is some weird turtle thing. You can also see some, well, apes, as well as this vulture-like bird which could have been an early idea for the zoo enemy. Before I get into my thoughts on the image on the left, I want to bring up the image on the right as well, as my thoughts on the first lead into my thoughts on this one. A big town atop a huge tree. This idea was definitely used for what we now know as Clara, which is also a town on top of a giant tree. Now, even though these two concepts are very different, they both have elements of what we got in the final game in Clara. The first one has ape-like creatures, which I believe could have been the developer's idea for a race of people before we got the Burmesians. There's also this vulture, which seems to be the only thing they left in from this idea, as you do find the zoo near the top of the tree in Clara. The next image is far closer to what the final idea became. Instead of having houses on multiple trees in a forest, we got one big-ass tree with an entire city on it. While there is more concept art that I'd like to talk about in more detail, I think I'll leave that for another time. With all that aside, let's take a look at the last clip. And this isn't just any old cutscene. Final Fantasy IX is full of minigames and side quests, many of which are quite a lot of fun. Others, not so much. But this cut minigame, which has Vivi running around Alexandria's town square collecting balloons, well, it sucks. It doesn't look fun. Granted, it doesn't seem to be quite finished either, but I'm having a difficult time thinking of any way that they could have improved this minigame. The developers probably thought the same thing, which is why it was thrown out. It's hard to determine what sort of prize we would get from this minigame, though it does show Vivi receiving a Phoenix Pinion from an NPC who doesn't really seem to be part of the minigame. Now, I know this minigame is nothing earth-shattering, but it was one gameplay aspect that was removed, whereas most of the dummy-note content is minor script and scene changes. So while the minigame itself isn't that great of an idea, and the game as a whole is better for not having made it in, it is still neat to see, and it makes me wonder what other sort of minigames never saw the light of day. So because that last clip wasn't exactly as interesting as most people probably would have liked, I'll throw in one last piece of bonus trivia. During the events in which the party splits up into groups of 2 in order to fight the Chaos Guardian simultaneously, we only get to actually battle the Earth Guardian with Zane and Quina. In the coding of the game, all the enemies are given an ID number. There are numbers missing from the sequence around the Earth Guardians, suggesting that those spots were meant for the other Guardians. Instead of actually fighting them in the final game, we are shown them defeated via cutscenes, and while this would have been a really cool idea from a gameplay perspective, I can see why this was cut. Two big reasons I can think of is that this would have been one hell of a boss gauntlet with probably no saves in between, and the fact that both of your healers are together, meaning that it would have been pretty difficult for Steiner and Vivi, or Freya and Amarant to survive the battles, as the use of items to recover lost HP wouldn't be very efficient. At least with Quina, you could potentially have White win during the Earth Guardian fight. While they could have worked around this, it was probably easier for the developers to cut the other 3 fights out completely. You do get to fight the other Guardians throughout Memoria though. These boss fights are encountered at predetermined points with no context leading into them, which is likely a throwback to how the Guardians are encountered in the original Final Fantasy. And in the area just before the final boss, you can find them again in random encounters. During these random encounters, they don't give you any experience as well, as if they were a boss. It's possible that the data for the Guardians was reworked and implemented here instead of having them fought separately earlier in the game. So despite there not being a treasure trove of unused content to talk about for Final Fantasy IX, there are a few extra cutscenes and quite a lot of concept art that I didn't talk about that I would have liked to. However, I did find the collection I compiled here to be the most compelling, at least in my opinion. And that's about it for unused content for Final Fantasy IX. This has been a lot of fun to make. Final Fantasy IX is my favorite in the series, and despite playing it countless times over the past 20 years, I learned a lot that I didn't know, and I hope that you learned something as well. I do have other plans for content related to this on other games as well as Final Fantasy, topics that I haven't really seen covered yet on YouTube, or if it is there, I'm just stupid and I don't notice it. So if you enjoyed the video, feel free to stick around if you want to see what I got planned next. Thank you very much for anyone who watched this. I'm Xenorous, and have a good day. Or don't. I'm not in charge of you.